another author talk in this series, ongoing series that we have here in the Ozarks Room, which is part of the Ozarks Studies Institute, which is an ongoing initiative of the MSU Library. So welcome everyone. I'm Tom Peters, Dean of Libraries. We have a great speaker today and a great topic. For years, I've been a big fan of oral histories in general. We have quite an ongoing program here at MSU, but I cannot top Alex Primm because he's been doing oral histories for 40 years. So I'm going to have to start taking better care of myself. I'm going to reach that mark. He's also, what an amazing life. He served as a correspondent in Vietnam. He ran the Ozark Agricultural Museum at Maramec Spring Park, just down the road. And he's produced award-winning regional videos. And he's taught in mainland China. So please join me in welcoming Alex Primm.
Thank you, Tom and Laura French. And thank you all for coming by today. I see this as a very informal discussion. I don't have prepared slides. Nathan here is recording this, so it will be available as a live feed and also on YouTube in the future. I want to particularly thank the people who I interviewed for this book. It was a project that lasted more than 10 years. I particularly want to thank my wife, Kathy. Where's Kathy hiding in the corner? She helped me with a lot of computer problems and other issues of recording and transcribing interviews. It's something that I gradually learned how to do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do oral history, and then I'm going to play or read or present 3 interviews from the book. So you get some sense of how to do interviews. This should only take 10 or 15 minutes. And then I thought we would just talk about oral history and this map. I made this map 20 years ago for some storytelling I did around the Ozarks, because as I gathered all these stories, I really got interested in how the whole thing fit together. There was a man who was active at the turn of the last century, up into the 1920s and 30s, named Nathaniel Stub Borders. How many of you ever heard of Stub Borders? One person. George Clinton Arthur wrote a book about him in the 1940s because he was one of the last people to raft railroad ties down the Big Piney and the Gasconade River. And I just got so fascinated with what he did and how these people turned oak trees into the beds of railroads all over going west. So doing oral history at Fort Leonard Wood on the Big Piney, I got interested in this book. And that led me to make this map and to go to church groups, historical societies, and other organizations to talk about how it all fits together. And that's what I try to do in this book, is get some sense of the Ozarks as a whole and something that is really quite unique in the United States. There is you can sort of see it here. There's a spine that goes down the northern part of the Ozarks. Who knows what that spine, that trail was called? Well, that's what it became. Before they had covered wagons and horses, it was called the White River Trace because you could go from St. Louis. It was basically a system of Indian trails that went down into Arkansas, into the White River country. And there's one story in this book that I heard about, actually from a man when I was giving a program. And he said the way the old tie hackers could do it is even before the tie hackers, there were people rafting pine timber down the down the Piney River, the Little Piney, the Big Piney, the Gasconade, to the Missouri River, to St. Charles, which was the state capital 200 years ago, 1822. And they would sell their lumber in St. Charles, and then they would have to head back to central Missouri or even down to Springfield. They didn't get a whole lot of money. They could buy one horse. Two men, a man and a woman could do it, but often it was two men running the tie rafts or the lumber rafts, and they could get back into the Piney River country in 2 days. How do you think they did that? Has anyone heard of how they traveled in the old days? Kathy's heard this story many times. They would start down the trail. Charlie would start riding the horse, and he would go for 5 or 10 miles, then he'd tie up the horse, and then his buddy, let's call him Charlie, would catch up to where the horse had been tied up. And Joe was continuing down the trail, and Charlie would get on the horse, and he would ride up and pass Joe and go 5 or so miles, past Joe, tie up the horse, and then Charlie would continue walking the trail till he got where the horse was tied up. He would get on the horse and ride another 5 or 10 miles, leapfrogging each other, giving the horse a rest. Now, what is that called? That's the origin of the term hitchhiking. I've worked with a professor at the University of Missouri, Rolla School of, Dr. Gerald Cohen, and he said that that's probably a logical definition of the term hitchhike, because hitchhiking really doesn't have anything to do with sticking out your thumb. It was an earlier term that had to do with sharing a horse. And these hitchhikers who were coming back to their home territory after selling the horse could, after selling their timber, could cover 75 or more miles a day, both walking and getting a ride occasionally, and the horse would get a break too. So Jerry said you ought to study, try to find some more information about the etymology of this term hitchhiking. But it's the kind of story I put in this book. I have a lot of little short stories, and I just found so many things that I wanted to share, and this is the kind of story I have that I feel is unique and important. I'm going to share a story now that I have on a CD, and it's from the CD I have here called Tree Dialogues, and it's collections of stories about how trees are important to people. So I want to play that for you now. I think it should be ready to go. Let's see. Yeah, let's see, where's the play? Here it is.
My grandfather was a professional hunter, and by that I mean that he had dogs and horses and guns, and he would go to a farmer's house, and the farm would keep him, feed his dogs and him and his horses until he killed their winter's meat, killed and cured. They salted it, killed and cured their winter's meat.
This was your grandfather?
This is my grandfather.
And what was his name?
It's in there, James Meadows. It's in that book.
Okay.
His name is, and his picture's in there too. And so whenever they had all they wanted, then he'd go to the next farm, and he would kill and cure their meat for the winter. I think he started in about October and run all through the winter. And what he got out of it was his room and his board and the furs and the skins and the furs. And come spring, by spring he would have a wagon load of furs and skins and he would go to take them to St. Louis and sell them. That'd be his money for that year. And evidently, they were a pretty good price, the furs were. So anyhow, she told me about this particular year. I mean, he told me, Desi's father told me about this particular year. My dad, my grandfather, I mean, had come to their house and then went on to all the other houses and got their winter's meat. Then it came spring, and it was time for him to go to St. Louis, sell his furs. So he started to St. Louis with his wagon load of furs all piled up, you know, and skins. And so on his way, he was just about to Rolla the first day, and he camped that night, and he slept under his wagon, and he built a box. And evidently, he got too much fire, too close to the hides, and then, you know, I don't know what you know about skins, but they're very, they'll burn quick. A lot of suet on them, you know, dried suet, that's like grease. And so the wagon and the furs caught on fire and burned up. Well, that burned up my grandfather's, all his property. And he didn't have anything else. That's all he had was that wagon, and his horses, and his dogs, and his guns, and the furs. And so that put him out of business. And so he, after that, Mr. McWilliams said, he didn't go back into the business anymore. He decided that he was too old for that. And so he went to California and stayed with my aunt, that was his daughters, out there, and lived out there until he died.
Well, that was Aileen Hatch of Plato, Missouri. And she was a school teacher for many years. There are several stories from Aileen Hatch in this book. She was famous not only as a storyteller, but she had a great love of the Ozarks. And she lived on the Ruby Creek outside of town. She protected that creek. She was very cautious about people trespassing on her land, and there's a story in here about her doing that, protecting her land. And she is the kind of person who I just was glad to capture her story, because she is a little bit well known. She was on the cover of the Missouri Conservationist magazine when she was in her early 80s. She was wearing full camo, and she had an arrow notched in her bow. And she was getting ready to deer hunt. She was always at the opening of trout season every March 1st at Montauk. She just loved the outdoors, and there's a funny interview with her in the book when she took her one and only flight to New York City. David Letterman brought her on his show, and she's got a funny story about her visit with David Letterman. But I wonder if any of you have run into someone like Aileen Hatch, someone who tells you a story that you just can't forget, that is a remarkable story. Denise.
Yep, let me come with the mics for the Zoom audience.
Okay. That's great.
No pressure.
It's not quite as good as that, but I had a neighbor that she's now gone to a nursing home that she told me she grew up south of Springfield, I think around like Bradleyville. And she said when she was younger, she used to always like to follow her dad around, and she learned to do the farm work and stuff, but she didn't want to learn to be in the kitchen and cook and stuff like that. And she said when she got married, she told her husband, now, I don't know how to cook. And she said a couple months into their marriage, she heard him telling a friend of his that story. And he said, but I didn't think she was serious. She really could not cook. And he was really surprised. And I guess that was unusual for women at the time, that you know, they didn't learn the household chores. But anyway, I got a chuckle out of it.
Did he learn how to cook?
She learned how to cook. She gave me a recipe book that was all the neighbors and relatives and stuff in our neighborhood, because where we live is a big subdivision. It used to be just farmland,
Uh-huh.
but she has this cookbook she gave me, so I treasure it too.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's remarkable to me how people can carry along a visual image of people who are influential in their lives. And it's something that stays with you forever. I think it's really important to hold on to those memories. And one thing I've learned in oral history is if someone claims to remember something from long in the past, in their childhood, their memory is often accurate, because older people treasure their memories and replay them many times throughout their life. And these, you might call them flashbulb memories of important events, stay with you. And researchers have found that these memories from childhood are often more accurate than memories of the recent past for many older people. So if someone claims to remember something, it's often very accurate. Any other stories about the Ozarks and people who are special from? Yep.
Now this, remember, this has been maybe
Myra,
65
would
to
you mind
70
holding on to the mic?
Oh, sure, sure. I
Okay.
can. 65 to 70 years ago. So
Yeah.
I have a memory of these stories, but not as clear as probably
Uh-huh.
it should be. I had a great uncle, his name was Landon Holman, and we used to go and visit he and his wife, and he would just have story after story about his growing up in youth. And one I remember in particular, he talked about being on a cattle drive. And I think this is right. They were coming from Cassville back to, they were situated around Dade County and around Dadeville area was where their home had been. And he talked about there was one man along the route. They stopped and visited and I guess camped over there that night. And his cooking arrangement was he had a big hollowed out tree trunk kind of in the middle of the cabin. And I'm not sure if it was really inside the cabin or that could have even been outside. And that was his pot. And he cooked in that by throwing in heated stones, and he just added to it every day. I don't know how they didn't have food poisoning, but they all ate with that fellow.
What was he cooking in this stump?
That I have no idea.
Uh-huh.
Beans,
Uh-huh.
rabbits, squirrels, stew, I don't know.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, stories like that are really remarkable. There's so many interesting stories about food. There's several in the book here. I wanted to read another story. This is from the recent past. I find exciting about the Ozarks is that there still are a lot of really interesting people moving into this area. Even though we don't have frontier conditions anymore, where people are living a subsistence way of life, but there are a lot of people who have unique ways of living and who have, they're inspired by the Ozarks in different ways. And this is a story, I'm just going to read part of it from a man named David Haenke, who has been involved in conservation in the Ozarks for many years. He started an organization called the Ozark Area Community Congress, where a lot of young people who were back to the landers in the 1970s and 80s would come together and would share their stories and what they'd learned living in the Ozarks. So David got to be head of a land trust along the Bryant Creek. So I'll just read what I wrote here about his project. The Alfred Forest and the Ozark Regional Land Trust have worked out a management plan to protect the forest along Bryant Creek, streams, and the nearby creek itself. You can read about the Alfred Forest on their website. It's a not-for-profit organization. Ecological land management is clearly spelled out on their website. Further protection became possible in January of 2020, when a project David Haenke has been working on for a decade finally came through. The California Air Resource Board Cap and Trade program has bought for $600,000 the carbon credits resulting from ecological management of Alfred Forest. The credits result from the high amount of carbon sequestration associated with ecological management of Alfred Forest. Quote, "It's a big deal because we believe these funds will provide a steady flow of income to assure the forest is managed and protected for the next 125 years, David explained. The details of carbon credits are complex. Some people don't trust them. I think it's worth trying. A large tract to the east near the Current River, the 4,000-acre forest in Shenandoah, an historic mission project of the United Church of Christ, became the first carbon credit project in Missouri. Finalized in 2015, it's also the first carbon credits anywhere gained by a church. Such experimental projects attract unique people. I know David well enough to state this effort required all his reservoirs of patience, passion, and acumen over the years. Maybe he's a modern day Thoreau. Ella Alfred, whose family owned the property originally, shared a similar expansive version of what a forest deserves from owners and can offer the wider world. I met Ella Alfred once or twice at the Ozark Area Community Congress. I met many other inspiring folks at these bioregional sessions over the years. Unfortunately, the Oral History Association conference, which I also have attended, is usually held at the same time of year. So I share this story mainly because it's something that's happening right now, that this man was able to see a family's project be turned into a not-for-profit project. The family kept a small part of the 3,000 acres, but put most of it into this not-for-profit land trust that they and the public can use. And then this government agency in California bought the carbon credits, which assure that the only cutting that will be done in this forest are sustainably planned by a forester, so that there'll be no heavy clear cutting. And the same thing happened on a bigger scale over south of Salem, Missouri, at Shenandoah. Shenandoah is just on the Cotaway Hills here. And I wonder if any of you have heard of projects like that that are worth talking about, that are new projects in the Ozarks that deserve attention. I try to have some projects like this in the book that are things that are continuing, because we really have a great heritage here of conservation. And I just think it's something that we have to find new ways to protect the land. And David has found a new way that the interest from the $600,000 will pay foresters to manage the land. And it's really a great project, I think. Yeah.
David Haenke is actually having heart surgery today, so keep him in your thoughts. And I see Todd Parnell sitting here. I'm thinking of the Ozark Society, and we just saw a movie about the saving of the buffalo. And I don't know if that's the same kind of thing, but it sort of is. And you all can see that movie too. Just go to the Ozark Society website and you can stream it on your computer. It's really wonderful.
That's right. Yeah, this is the 50th anniversary of the Ozark River becoming a national park, being protected. And it's something that, you know, it doesn't happen automatically. There was a possibility of a big confinement feeding operation on a tributary stream. And the state and the National Park Service and volunteers were able to find a way to not have the CAFO continue to protect the water quality of the stream. So we can't take it for granted. There's always challenges because we live in a very complex society where there's always going to be demands put on natural resources. So we just have to do what we can to protect them. And I see oral history as one way of doing it, one way of informing people about what are the issues, what are the challenges of the past, and how people are moving ahead to meet them. Okay, let's see. I have one other story I'd like to share. And let's see, what was that? Oh yeah, this is a story. I'm not going to read this. I'm going to tell the story because it's a very personal story for me, but I think it's a challenging one. My father worked in the newspaper business for 40 years, and he really got me attracted to the Ozarks. He came down to the Ozarks. I grew up in St. Louis, and I sort of got my love of fishing and the rivers from my father. And he was active in an organization called the Nature Conservancy. And towards the end of his life, he started a project that sort of backfired on him. And the whole story is told in the book. He came up with this idea of selling the water rights to the Anheuser-Busch Company from Greer Spring, and they would bottle the water and sell it commercially. And there was never a formal agreement, but my father's feeling was that a private organization could do a good job of protecting a natural resource like Greer Spring if they were using it for a use that was not a consumptive use, it was a renewable use. They would be taking a relatively limited amount of water. They were taking just a limited amount of water from the spring, and it would give people in Oregon County a chance to make some money, at the bottling plant. And he thought it was a great idea. Well, conservationists in St. Louis got word of this plan, and it sort of backfired. They developed a campaign against Anheuser-Busch buying any rights to water from Greer Spring, and it became such a controversy. It was a real embarrassment for my father because he sort of did it was like a business deal for him. He hadn't really gone through quite the right channels in developing this project. And I think it created a lot of stress in his life. And so I have the story about this in the book of how Greer Spring almost became a commercial water source. But I could sort of see my father's point that maybe a business could be a good place to protect natural resources. And I thought that would be something we could discuss today. I wonder if any of you have heard of things like that. Susan? We want to get you on the program, Susan.
I'm not sure if it's Nestle. but
Okay.
There's some, and this is one of those things, I need details, but I don't have them. There's a little town in Wisconsin where a company has come in to bottle the water, and there's no more water in the town.
Oh.
And I read about it because they were suing the company just using up all their water. So I'm not sure I think it's a good idea at all.
Right. Yeah, anyone else have any feelings about commercial sources? Yeah, Denise.
Just say, a lot of times it starts out as a good idea, but unless there's a lot of controls, like Susan was just saying, then profit becomes the, driving force instead of the conservation. And I think that there's a history of that, of people thinking something good is starting and then it turns on them and it's not, and by that time it's too late to pull the plug and do anything about it. So I do think we have to be very careful about that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think there needs to be, have things really well planned out ahead of time. And it's interesting, after this proposal was developed with the Anheuser-Busch Company, it was sold, the St. Louis brewery was sold to an international conglomerate. So who knows what would have happened with a new owner for a natural resource like a spring. But I do think that we have to be creative. I know the National Park Service in many cases now is not buying up all the land in the natural area. They're allowing people to farm as long as there's covenants or protection for natural areas. So people can continue using the real estate. I know there's some national parks where the government used eminent domain and took over a lot of farms. And I think in the Shenandoah Valley, a lot of longtime residents who've been there for generations lost their farms. And maybe, the Park Service is rethinking that policy of taking by eminent domain land when there may be other ways of managing natural land. Yeah, Todd.
Alex, the pig farm you and your wife mentioned.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. This used to be one of my students. Isn't it? The pig farm you and your wife were mentioning is an interesting study of contradictions. It was a family that had been in the Buffalo watershed for decades, if not centuries, an old way back family that people trusted to do what was right for the buffalo. And they felt like they could do something that would, this was their public statement, could add some jobs to an area that wasn't really that wealthy or that
could use the economic stimulus.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
And I went floating with my son when all this was going on, and we got flooded off the river not far from Mount Judy, where the pig farm was. And I told him I really wanted to go up and see this place. And he was horrified, but he drove me up there and went into the general store. And I said, how can I go down to the CAFO? And they said, you can't, the road's blocked. And I said to this lady, what do you think about this CAFO in your backyard? And she said, she was kind of quiet and she could see I was an outsider, so probably didn't have much use for me. She said, it's just a couple of good old boys trying to make a living. And that was the attitude of a lot of the community. And what those good old boys ended up doing was becoming millionaires because the state and the Nature Conservancy bought them out for $7 million.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. So
there's a lot of still resentment down there on one side or the other. And I think it speaks to what you were saying that, there's a economic development ethic and there's a environmental ethic, and marrying them, like Susan said, I think is pretty difficult to do in the bottom line.
Did the land where the CAFO was going to be, was that sold to the Park Service?
It was bought back by the state, and they have put a permanent moratorium on any kind of corporate farming in it. And I don't know what they're going to do with it, but it'll probably become a park of some sort.
Yeah.
Was that a private business or did they?
It was
sell
private.
to a corporation?
They ran it as CAFOs do, where the farmer provides the land and gets an SBA loan for the building. And then the corporation, in this case, I can't remember which one it was, but it was one of the big meat producers, provides them with the livestock and the drugs and the feed and everything else, and a market for them so that they won't lose money. It's a very insidious arrangement to me. To some people, I guess it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me.
Well, agriculture has changed so much that it is getting to be, dairies are no longer somebody hand milking cattle, that they're big operations, and it's going to be something that's going to cause issues no matter what.
And I am a hypocrite. I buy my meat at the grocery store from time to time. However, what I'm so perplexed about is why you have to put things that put water at risk in places where the water is the lifeblood of the local economy. And
Right.
Maybe that's not in my backyard mentality, but there are places where I can see these things happening, but the Ozarks is certainly not one.
Right. Got to protect the water. Susan?
This is probably a good time to say, if you want to know the story of the CAFOs and the local community in a easy to read manner, Todd has written about 6-8 books about this. The first one was called Pig Farm, so it's real easy to find, and I would highly recommend it.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think the nice thing about oral history is you get a lot of different sides of a story, and you get it in depth. And that's what I wanted to do when I got into the field. And oral history is something that any of you can do now with your cell phone. It doesn't take the latest technology. You don't need a digital recorder. A cell phone can be a good way to begin doing oral history. And the Oral History Association has a lot of guidelines. Any other comments about oral history or conservation in the Ozarks? I think that's going to be a continuing issue.
I just wanted to say, I did oral history with my mom and dad, and I really tried to talk him into doing it, but he was busy at the time, and he says, you can do it, you've seen enough. So I did interview my mom and dad, and then I had the tapes, and I never did anything with them. And I don't know what happened, but they just sort of got put in a corner, you know, and then a couple of years ago, I found them and I played them, and they were just sitting right there in front of me. And I can encourage each one of you to do it. I'm sitting behind this lady who's a friend of mine. She needs to interview her mom and dad. Actually, I know them. They're very interesting, but it made a difference for me. You know, I mean, and I was able to give those tapes to their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and they don't even know their grandma or great-grandma. So it was really important. Now they do.
Right. Okay. Tom, how are we doing time-wise? Okay. Any other stories about oral history from anyone? I could go on about the book. Let me just tell you one thing about the book, since I hope a few of you will buy it, but don't feel pressured in any way, because I think Springfield Greene County Library, the University Library will have copies. But it does make a great gift if you do want to buy one. After you read it, the nice thing about a hard copy is you can pass it on as in any kind of form. The book has 3 parts, or there's actually 8 parts, but each part begins with an introduction that talks about how to do oral history, what my experience was on different kinds of projects with the U.S. Geological Survey or the Forest Service or Fort Leonard Wood. And then there's examples in each part, several short chapters of interviews with people. And then the end of each part has a short essay that's like a memoir of what it was like for me to do the oral history. And one reason I wrote it in this way is I hoped it could be something that would be a manual for students and people who are interested in how to interview their family and friends. So it's How to Do It book.
Alex, what's the most embarrassing interview you ever did?
The most embarrassing thing that happened to me is I got to a woman's farm on the upper Big Piney River. I had everything. I had my permission slips. I had everything but a recorder. And she said, "We've got one in the tool shed. Let's just see if it works." And I found some tapes. This was back in the days of cassette tapes. We put a cassette tape in and I pressed the play and record button, and 3 or 4 big wood roaches ran out of that recorder, but it worked. And that's what happened to me. There's so many little details in doing an interview that you have to take time to get right. And it was always a challenge for me. But, it's always good to have a few prepared questions when you start an interview, but then I just sort of follow the thread of whatever topic people bring up. It's not a hard process, and it's really fun to interview someone. You'll always find something new when you're interviewing somebody, something you had never heard before. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kathy, and Tom, and Laura, and Nathan. Hope you enjoyed it.